the most controversial thing in American-German relations is the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline would allow natural gas to be transported directly from Russia to Germany, to Deutschland. The Americans don't like this. They don't like this project at all because they fear that it would get Germany to become energy dependent on the Russians and thus get closer to the Russians and more distant from the Americans. And Donald Trump did quite a good job in pissing off the Germans to the point where the relationship between the Americans and the Germans right now has become more hostile now since the Second World War. The Germans are really becoming more and more obviously anti-American would be a very conspicuous term, but to make it more diplomatic, we could say Germany is becoming more and more distant from American power. Now, America still controls Germany, but the Germans are more and more becoming favorable to the idea of becoming independent of American power, independent of the American security umbrella, or really the American empire. And so the Germans want to become they want to become their own world power. And one thing that really revealed this was Trump's rhetoric. Trump saying, "Oh, you Germans, why don't you pay for your own fair share? Why is America always having to pay for your security, et cetera, et cetera?" And the Germans are like, yeah, you know what, America? You're absolutely right. We're just going to make our military great again, yeah? So German hostility to the United States has always been there. I mean, America defeated the Germans in the Second World War and also in the First World War. Hatred like that just doesn't go away. It's not like, after the Second World War, people just woke up and said, you know what, we really like the Americans. Yeah, they're really, really great people. We were so wrong. And I'm sure many Germans came to that conclusion, like, F this Third Reich stuff, this nationalism stuff is garbage. Many Germans came to that conclusion. There's no doubt about that. But enough Germans, I believe, still harbor this animosity towards American power because the United States controls Germany. Because, if you defeat Germany in the Second World War, you have the right to become a world empire. And America became just that. It became a world empire, and it rules the world. But the Germans, they want a way to get they want a way to break the fetters of American power, and one of the ways to do that is to get closer to Russia. And really, by doing that, you piss the Americans off, and you show the Americans, listen, I know you guys hate Russia, I know you guys don't want us to become dependent on the Russians, but we're going to do that just in spite of you guys. So the Germans and the Russians started doing this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They're almost done. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline is damn near completed. It's got like 124 kilometers to go or something like that. And the Americans, of course, began to impose sanctions last year on all of the European companies involved in the construction of Nord Stream 2. There was one company, I think it was a Swiss company, that decided to pull out of the project because it was afraid of the sanctions. And this really angered the Germans. They obviously don't like this, and so they were looking for a way to bypass the Americans and the Russians as well. The Russians and the Germans have been looking for a way to bypass American power. And how have they decided to do this? Well, the Germans created a foundation. It's kind of like a nonprofit, I guess. I'm not sure if it's a nonprofit. I'm not familiar at all to how Europeans do foundations and create foundations. But nonetheless, the Germans created a foundation. It's called the Climate and Environmental Protection MV Foundation. It is presented as an organization in favor for environmentalism, bettering the environment, making the world a more green place. And literally the entire organization is dedicated to finishing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. All of the money that has been donated to this organization comes from Gazprom. Gazprom is the big oil company of Russia. And the money is going to be used to complete the pipeline, bottom line. So the Germans and the Russians have found a loophole by which to bypass the Americans, and they have done so by the help of by creating an organization, by creating something akin to a nonprofit. It is fascinating to see this, but it really makes you wonder, like, the whole thing about Germany versus the United States. I think we're still stuck in this kind of post-war mentality of, well, the Germans are our friends, they're our allies. Yes, we had a war, but we're really good friends. And one thing that Trump did was he really revealed that is just it's just a front. It's all diplomacy. It's a diplomatic face. That's all it really is. Behind that diplomatic face, it pretty much comes down to, we rule over you, and we don't want you to do anything that we don't like. We've seen this numerous times. Years ago, I think this was back in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, or 2011. It was in the early 2000s. Germany wanted to build some natural gas plants in Iran, and as soon as people in the pro-Israel lobby found out, they were saying, well, look, these Germans, they're going to do business with Iran. They're not supposed to do this. Iran's an enemy of Israel. Iran wants to destroy Israel. Germany can't do this. And so America began to pressure the Germans. You can't build these natural gas plants, et cetera, et cetera. And now the Germans, they want to do this pipeline with the Russians. Now, one of the geopolitical ramifications of this pipeline would be Poland and Ukraine becoming less and less geopolitically important in regards to Polish and Russian tensions and Russian and Ukrainian tensions, because the Russians, they have to go through Ukraine to transplant their natural gas. So if the Russians want to send natural gas to Europe, the Russians have to go through Ukraine. And every time the Russians go through Ukraine, Ukraine makes billions, because the Russians have to pay a fee to the Ukrainians. Same thing goes with the Poles. Russia has to also go through Poland, and the Poles make money. The Russians are sick and tired of doing this. They don't want to keep paying Ukraine. They don't want to have to keep paying Poland. The Russians and the Ukrainians don't like each other, and sure as hell, the Poles and the Russians don't like each other for obvious reasons. The Russians butchered Ukrainians and Poles during the reign of the Soviet Union's terror, and during the reign of Soviet terror, the Russians butchered hundreds of thousands of Poles and killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. And there's a lot of animosity between these countries. So why the hell would Russia want to pay these people money? Secondly, if the Russians can just send natural gas directly to Europe without having to go through Ukraine or having to go through Poland, if the Russians can just send natural gas to Germany without having to pay money to the Poles or to the Ukrainians, then the Poles and the Ukrainians, they don't have so much geopolitical leverage, because if Russia has to go through Ukraine, Ukraine can say, well, you guys are sending your natural gas through us. Well, we have some demands, we have some stipulations. The Poles can utilize the same type of leverage, geopolitical leverage. But without Russia having to go through those countries, those two countries lose that leverage. They lose that power. They lose that influence. And that makes Russia more powerful in Eastern Europe. And that also helps the Germans as well, because now the Germans can get natural gas from Russia, and the Germans can, basically tell the Americans to screw off. It's a way for Germany to distance itself further and further away from the American sphere of influence. This is about the rise of Germany. Essentially, that's what this is, and that's what we're seeing. We are seeing the rise of Germany. We began to see the Germanic rebellion against the American empire after the Americans pulled out of the Iran deal. The Americans pulled out of the Iran deal, and then the Americans began to pressure other countries to do the same thing. The Americans began to pressure other countries to no longer do business with the Iranians, and the Germans have been, at least within the EU bloc, the Germans have been the biggest resistors to America's pressure to no longer do commerce or business with Iran. The Germans made a lot of money with the Iranians and vice versa, and the Germans don't just want to stop doing business with Iran because America told them to. Now, why did America pull out of the Iran deal? Well, people can say, well, it's because the Iranians were lying, and they can't really prove that. They'll say, well, the Iranians were making nuclear weapons behind our backs. They can't really prove that. Sometimes I forget this institution. I think it was the Atomic Energy. What was it? The Atomic something Energy Association. I don't remember. But this association, which was in charge of superintending Iran's nuclear activities, declared numerous times Iran's not breaking the rules. Iran is, keeping to protocol. And the Israelis said, no, that's all a lie. Iran is secretly making weapons and blah, blah, blah. And Israel really couldn't prove it. But they had some evidence that wasn't really substantial, nor was it really emphatic or worthy of conclusion. But beyond all that, regardless of all that, and regardless if you believe the Iranians or if not the Iranians, regardless if you believe the Atomic Energy Association or if you believe the UN or if you believe Netanyahu, regardless of all that, the bottom line is one thing that I think we're going to be seeing in the future is the rise of the European against Israel. See, for decades, we've been used to the Muslim world hating Israel and hating the Jews, right? We've been so used to Islamic anti-Jewish sentiment and hatred. And we've never really seen upfront explicit European hatred against Jewish people. We've read about it, especially when we read about World War II and the Holocaust, but we've never seen it. We've never seen it in our own generation. Present-day generations haven't really seen it unless they lived in Europe during the Second World War. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more of this because when Germany wanted to build some natural gas plants in Iran, there was the pro-Israel lobby. When Germany wants to do business with Iran, there's the pro-Israel lobby saying, Germany, you can't do that, you can't do that. And when Germany wants to do an oil pipeline with the Russians, it's the same neoconservative forces that are trying to prevent Germany from doing what it wants to do. And one of the things that are necessary for harmony between people is freedom. People need to have an idea, people need to have a sense of freedom, or at least believe that they have a sense of freedom. Once they lose that conviction that they have freedom, and once they are controlled, they begin to rebel. People begin to become violent. And if the Germans keep being told that they can't do what they want to do, if the Germans keep being told, you can't do this because Israel or because America doesn't like that, guess what's going to happen with the Germans? They're going to become more anti-American and more anti-Israel. And the anti-Jewish hatred that we're so used to hearing about when we look into German history or when we watch any sort of documentary on the Second World War is going to revive itself. I did a video about this back in, I want to say 2018. YouTube took it down for anti-Semitism, but I'm simply warning people. This is not me saying, oh yeah, the Jews are evil. No, I'm not saying that at all. I am warning you guys. I am warning people about what is to come. I am warning people. Consider this video a warning on the rise of German anti-Semitism. Because if this continues on, then that's what we're going to see. People are going to become more anti-American and more anti-Israel. And as the years go by, Israel becomes more and more irrelevant in political discourse. It was very relevant in for my parents' generation. It still is. The boomers are very pro-Israel. They tend to be very pro-Israel. Millennials do have some faction of Zionism and pro-Israel sentiment. Amongst the Zoomers, not so much. People don't really care about Israel. People are, for the most part, very indifferent to the cause of Israel. And I think that this is a dangerous thing. People could say, well, Ted, that's a good thing. Israel is evil. Israel is bad. Israel takes all this American aid. I'm not saying that Israel is exempt from criticism, but what I am saying is that there is nonetheless a dangerous ramification when we start seeing people becoming more and more anti-Israel. There's something very dangerous about that, because people who hate Israel, they're not going to hate Israel because of some legitimate criticism, right? And even if there is legitimate criticism, that does not warrant hatred for other people. So when people hate Israel, even if they point to legitimate criticism, that hatred goes beyond that legitimate criticism, and it stems from something that is destructive, because hatred, at the end of the day, is destructive. Hatred, for the most part, at the end of the day, is very destructive. And so when that hatred becomes more and more popular and more people harbor that hatred, you're going into some very dangerous waters, because people eventually will die. And we've already seen this. There already have been a number of shootings against synagogues. There was a shooting in a synagogue in Germany. It's scary stuff. It is scary stuff. So I think that this story about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, it really marks a dark reality. And that dark reality is that German-American tensions are still here. They have been covered. They have been sort of abated by diplomacy and trade and the fact that America kicked ass. But nonetheless, the tension is still there. And there needs to be some series of events that will eventually reveal this hatred and this tension in its full totality. And I think we've already been seeing this. We've been seeing this since 2017. We've been seeing this since 2016 with Brexit, America's support for Brexit through the Trump administration, Trump telling the Germans to basically pay for their own security, Germany then getting the impression that America is indifferent towards its security, Great Britain leaving the European Union, leading the Germans to conclude, well, the British aren't really our allies, the Americans really aren't our allies. This is what was being said by Angela Merkel, of all people. So it's very real. The tension is there, and we have to be prepared for some serious geopolitical turbulency. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.